Good afternoon, and welcome to this, the Centre for Geopolitics event. I am Brendan Sims, the Director of the Centre for Geopolitics. Our speaker this afternoon is Jonathan Haslam. Jonathan is the author of about a dozen books, including a trilogy on Soviet foreign policy before the Second World War, several books on the Cold War, and many works on the theory or the history of the theory of international relations. He's a fellow of the British Academy, fellow of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and emeritus professor in the history of international relations at Cambridge. He has just retired as the George F. Kennan Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and is currently researching the literary left of Latin America and the Cuban Revolution. He has a blog, runs a blog on contemporary Russia called throughrussianeyes.com. He will be speaking to his new book, The Spectre of War, International Communism and the Origins of World War II, which is published by Princeton University Press and available from all good bookshops. Before we begin, I would like to mention that this session is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days at the links shown in the chat. Now, Jonathan will speak for about half an hour, followed by discussion with me. You, the audience, may also ask questions throughout the event, and I invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to do so. Please give your name and your institution, if you have one, when sending in a question. You can submit questions at any point throughout the event, and I'll do my best to get through as many as possible. But now, without any further ado, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just say it's a great pleasure to speak in Cambridge on a Cambridge monitor on the subject of my new book, The Spectre of War. I only have half an hour, so I'm going to be rather brief, and you can doubtless pick holes in what I'm going to say as a result. I think the thrust of the book, which is that the Second World War cannot be explained in the rather tantalizingly old-fashioned way, for example, that A.J.P. Taylor did, even though his book at the time in the early 60s was extremely radical in its propositions, because he talked in terms of power and balance of power and relations of power in abstraction from the world of ideas, which was a very peculiar thing for a man to do who'd been member of the British Communist Party at one time. And what I wanted to get to in this talk, which is what the book's about, is the role of ideas, and I would say rather sinister ideas, in the making of the Second World War. Now, most of us, when we studied this subject at university as undergraduates, were well aware that Adolf Hitler was driven by ideas, obsessed with ideas, very, very few ideas, but those ideas seemed to drive him forward. And those ideas were quite basic, at least overtly. They were anti-Bolshevism, anti-communism. Communism is the great threat. And secondly, the fear, or the fears he engendered from the existence of the Jewish people. And somehow these two things come together, as they came together in Adolf Hitler's own life in Bavaria, because the revolutionary movements that were surging through Germany after the defeat of Germany during World War I, those movements were often led and pushed forward by Jewish intellectuals, because they were veritable outsiders, not the industrialists, the intellectuals. And the same in Russia, leading Bolsheviks were themselves Jews. So in a sense, Adolf Hitler's views in the most primitive and reduced form put these two notions together. Now, as I was taught at university, one should completely ignore everything Adolf Hitler said about communism. It was like Mandy Rice Davis saying, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? And somehow in our lectures, every mention of this suddenly disappeared. And we were to suppose that all the engendering of war had to do with everything else, had to do with territory, had to do with wealth, had to do with, obviously, German national resentment at its treatment at the end of World War I. Those things, of course, are still true. But what one noticed in examining the role of appeasement, of Britain's policies, which really began under Baldwin, of trying to bring Germany back in. Germany had left, had walked out. It was a sort of Germany's Brexit, if you like. Germany had walked out of what was loosely viewed as another concert of Europe and seemed to be going its own way. And the question in London was, how do we get them back in? What can we do? What did we do that was wrong? And how can we get them back in? And the obvious answer was, well, it wasn't really our fault, it was the French. And that's always the convenient argument from the 1920s forward. So the British didn't view Germany going its own way as the product of some particularly inimical ideology. Somehow fascism was seen as setting the world to rights in countries that had gone wrong and wouldn't affect anyone else. They were a sort of internal matter. And under Mussolini in Italy, that's the way fascism seemed to be until Hitler came to power in Germany. And so Hitler did the unexpected. He suddenly made of it something international. And in this respect, anti-Bolshevism lay at the core of the creed. Let's jump forward just to illustrate this, since we don't have much time. Why were so many countries in Europe hostile to Soviet Russia, to the Soviet Union, to international communism? Is that really a puzzle? But that's the question, because in 1938 to 9, the most obvious thing that happened was that a coalition that would have formed for balance of power reasons, you would have thought, against Nazi Germany just didn't take place. And those alliances that did exist fell apart at the slightest touch. What was it? Well, if you look at the countries of Eastern Europe, for which Britain had very little regard at all since 1919, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, the Baltic states, they stood between the USSR and what were going to be advancing German forces. Those countries had suffered from the Russian Civil War, the destruction of the Russian Empire, and the coming to power of the Bolsheviks in Russia. The rulers of those countries, their deepest fear was the advance of the Red Army onto their territory. This had happened in Poland in 1920. And if they'd succeeded, if the Red Army had succeeded in Warsaw in defeating the Poles in 1920, the next target was Berlin, and the rest of Europe would just been swept up under its feet after that point. So you can imagine the Poles in particular were not eager to see a repetition of what happened in 1920. And every senior Polish politician and colonel, because Poland was run by the colonels, told every foreigner they ever met that the one thing they could never do was to ally with the Russians against anybody. And that meant even Germany. And in retrospect, it's easy to see that they should have taken one enemy at a time, and to the extent they would have done, they should have taken the Germans first and then worked out how to deal with the Russians next. But they didn't. They reckoned that their policy should be unchanged, a policy of hostility towards Moscow. If you take Romania to the south, well, Romania was allied with Poland. Romania really couldn't do anything without the Poles. But the Romanians too, they had a piece of territory the Russians coveted, and they had no desire to be Russified or Bolshevized from Moscow. And Czechoslovakia, which stood further into Central Europe, the Czechs were under, as it were, moderate social democrat types like Beneš, But Benish himself had always said that Soviet Russia was the greatest menace. And although the Czechs allied with France to try to contain the expansion of Nazi Germany in May 1935, they never got around to military talks. And the Czechs always took the view, and they said so explicitly, that they would not do anything against any other power, meaning Germany, without the French arriving there first. In other words, the Czechs were not willing to defend themselves in isolation. They needed the French there. French forces had to be in Czechoslovakia to defend them against any such threat against Nazi Germany, because they certainly didn't want the Russians coming in on their own, because they viewed it inevitable that Czechoslovakia would be Sovietized. Now, these are the smaller powers. They determine things on the margin. The most important power in Europe, other than France, was Britain. And Britain really took the view that the guarantee of frontiers in Eastern Europe, there's no way these frontiers could hold up. The frontiers that had been put in 1918 to 19 weren't really long-term propositions. And the British disregarded fears and concerns of Nazi Germany. The view in London tended to be, well, if the Germans are on the move, we'd rather they went in the direction of Moscow than in the direction of France. And to some extent, the French right shared that view. Now, why did the British take this view so strongly? Well, they took the view that Moscow was a serious threat to the future security of Europe. And they took that view not just because the Russians had tried to take Poland in 1920, but throughout the 1920s, from 1925 to 1927 in particular, the Russians represented the greatest threat to the British Empire. And remember, the British Empire was at its height in 1919. The British did nothing but grab everybody else's territory if possible. Bits of territory that made no sense had to be put into the hamper. And no sooner had they put everything in than things started falling out. This was an era of, if you like, the beginning of national liberation, the beginning of the end of colonialism. Even the schoolboys came out on strike in Cairo. The British couldn't hold down Palestine. The British had to use poison gas to hold Mesopotamia, what becomes Iraq. And in China, the whole thing blew apart, courtesy of the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese nationalists, backed by the Russians, by Russian money, Russian organization, Russian men. And this was lethal to the British economy, because the British economy had foolishly fixed its exchange rate to gold. British exports couldn't make any progress in foreign markets. The captive markets of India and China were essential to Britain. The British always feared the Russians would go for India, but Gandhi's movement of passive non-resistance allowed no space for them. Instead, they moved in on China, which was the most rewarding operation they could have been involved in. It was as a result of the revolution in China, which ultimately failed thanks to the British. I can get to that in a minute, that the British regarded Bolshevism as something that just had to be got rid of. Now, Britain couldn't do anything about it, even though Winston Churchill suggested in cabinet that they go to war with Russia and use Afghanistan as an excuse. The Russians crossed the Oxus and caused trouble in Afghanistan, but not as much trouble as the Afghans could cause. So most of the cabinet said no way, because the British taxpayer was not going to pay for another war after the last one. So there was no solution to the Bolshevik problem. When Hitler came along, he presented himself as the solution to the Bolshevik problem. And although most people didn't want to have anything to do with him, It was one thing to associate closely with him, and it was another thing to try to stop him. And if you like, British policy took the latter route. Now, what highlighted the problem of Bolshevism in the 1930s were two things. Firstly, the disturbances in France. France was not a settled country in the mid-30s. France was a settled country in the 20s. The Great Depression that smashed the economies of Europe hit France late, and it hit France in 1931 to 2, just before Hitler comes to power. And when the Depression hit France, French politics splintered badly, and you had the emergence of an extreme right alongside the extreme left of the Communist Party. And France started to succumb to a deep, deep malaise. All the class conflict that had been bottled up in the 20s then emerged with a vengeance in the 1930s. So to cut it short, by the summer of 1936, France is highly destabilized. There is a Popular Front government supported by the Communist Party to a degree, run by the socialists, and opposed fiercely by the fascist right. So how could you say communism was no importance in Europe? Well, you could say, well, yes, but the communists in France weren't that bad. There were Trotskyists and they were even worse. But it's rather saying, one is slightly more extreme than the other from London's point of view. The French, in response to their concerns about the rise of Hitler, were always asking for an alliance from Britain. France didn't have an alliance from Britain. And the last thing the British wanted to do was to associate closely with the French, partly because they blamed them for what happened after World War I, the bad relations with Germany, but partly also because France had drifted decisively to the left. And not only that, France in 1935, even under the right-winger Pierre Laval, France signed a treaty of alliance with the Soviet Union. And the British did their damnedest to stop that alliance taking place. Once it had taken place, the British tried to stop the alliance being ratified. Once it was ratified, the British started putting pressure to make sure there weren't any military talks between the French and the Russians. They worked at it. But then matters got worse because in Spain, which was, as it were, psychologically connected to France, because in Spain, the Frente Popular followed the Front Populaire in France. The left and the right diverged. The right was pushed by fascism, but also by the officers of the army. And you had civil war breaking out in July 1936 to end the Spanish Republic by the right. So in other words, instead of international relations in the interwar period being conducted on the basis of a sort of neutral view, who has what power, how do we balance power, all of a sudden international relations becomes a morass, a mess, and ideological definitions mattered more than power definitions. This was something pointed out very strongly by The Economist magazine in London, which, as it were, was the liberal conscience from the late 19th century. It deplored the fact that countries looked at one another according to their domestic makeup rather than the old-fashioned views of power. So Britain, remember, in response to this, was looking back at the 1920s. Well, it was obvious because the British had intercepted and decrypted Russian secret communication. Who was behind the events in China? The British were unable to decrypt Soviet and Comintern communications, the real ones. The Russians fed them some fake ones in the 1930s. So they were left to guesswork. MI6, which wasn't exactly pro-Bolshevik, always put the most extreme interpretation on everything. the intelligence agencies, the armed forces, the more conservative, as it were, or right-wing elements in the Conservative Party took a single view of the Spanish Civil War, is that whatever happens, the Republic shouldn't win. And the second view was, whatever happens, the French Republic, the French Front Populaire, should not help the Spanish Republic from winning. This would be a disaster because communism would be in Western Europe. So what you had to do was to actually dampen down the conflicts. Well, that was easier said than done. So the British decided, well, we've just got to stop anybody supplying the Spanish Republic with armaments because they kill people. Well, they kill the wrong people. They kill the right. They don't kill the left. So the British embark on this crazy policy, which reminds one of Douglas Hurd that Brendan Sims has written about in relation to Yugoslavia, a level playing field, but it was a level killing field, because they were depriving a non-level killing field. They were depriving one side of armaments against the other. So in other words, British policy on the Spanish Civil War showed the core of their thinking. No one should have been surprised that when Hitler took over what was known as German Austria in the spring of 1938, the British just sort of, ooh, well, you know, things happen, you know, probably expect us to do anything, but it's a long way away, you know. I mean, the British had been expecting the Germans to take over Austria since they signed the Versailles Treaty in 1919. So for them, this was Germans getting more Germans. And then when the Germans started to move on Czechoslovakia in the name of taking the German inhabited region of Czechoslovakia, namely Sudetenland. Oh, well, these are Germans, you know, I mean, Germans want to be with Germans. It's quite understandable. So you get an extraordinary level of rationalization as to why fascism needed to progress. They viewed fascism as an unstable, dynamic entity. And if you stopped it still, it would collapse in on itself. And if it collapsed in on itself, what would come up? You know, a nice, comfortable political bourgeois democracy? Of course not. Communism. Where were all these communists? I mean, Germany had had the largest communist party in Europe. Do you expect that if fascism collapsed in Germany, these people wouldn't pop out again and take over the country? And whereas the British under Lloyd George at the end of World War I viewed the Russians as sort of, I don't know, high-level incompetence. So Lloyd George took the view that if the Russians had Bolshevism, you know, so what? They'll never be able to manage anything. The one thing he did worry about was that what if Germans had Bolshevism? Oh, God, you know, efficiency plus ruthless, fanatical determination to change the world. Major disaster. Of course, that's what the Russians were always hoping for. So on the Russian side, which I haven't really mentioned because I've covered that elsewhere before, on the Russian side, you can imagine Stalin looking at all this saying, you know, should we give the British the benefit of the doubt? You know, well, the Russians were reading British communications, whereas in the 20s, the British were reading Russian communications. In the 30s, the Russians were, and not only that, they had the Cambridge Five made famous by Chris Andrew. I mean, they had people at the top of government. They had a direct line to Neville Chamberlain's thinking. Neville Chamberlain, the prime minister who signed away the future of Czechoslovakia at Munich in September 1938. They had access to this. Guy Burgess was one of their main lines through to MI6. And MI6's thinking was, you know, the Russians are still the great menace, not the Germans. So Stalin reading this drew obvious conclusions. Now, one doesn't have to be concerned about whether these people were good people or bad people. A lot of people who work on the history of the Soviet Union are obsessed with the notion that Stalin was evil. Of course he was evil, but not all Russians were evil. And not all Russians in Stalin's government were evil. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had them shot. So you have to take a view that what would a rational Russian have done given British policy in the 1930s? Any rational Russian would have in the end thought, well, for the short term, we just have to keep the Germans at bay. And if necessary, come to some terms with them, but prepare for the worst. The trouble was that when Stalin came to terms with Hitler, with the non-aggression pact and the secret protocol dividing Poland and the Baltic states and Romania in 1939, he was then relieved and self-satisfied and thought, well, it'll be years before the Germans could get to us. I mean, they've got to deal with Western Europe. They've got to deal with this huge French Air Force and army. They've got to take Scandinavia. They've got to take Britain. You know, this is ridiculous. It'll take them too long. And so the Russians became complacent and suffered grievously. No one suffered more than them. In June 1941, June 22nd, 4 o'clock in the morning in the mist, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe came in and Stalin hesitated. He thought it might be a trap. So forces were told to stand down. It was an absolute disaster. The fact the Russians lost 27 million people, 27 million is the latest estimate. 27 million people was really due to the fact that in the end, Stalin was unprepared in June 1941.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think you've given us the best possible reason to go to your book and to follow up many of these themes. I suppose the question that came to me reading The Spectre of War and listening to was the choice of the title. I thought was interesting. And I wondered, could you say a little bit more about that? Because if you'd called the book The Spectre of Revolution, that would have been one thing, but you called it The Spectre of War. And I wondered whether there was a reason why you call it the one and not the other.
Because my publisher liked it. That's a short answer, but there was a spectre of war haunting Europe from really 1919 through to the war itself. The point about it was that where would this war come from? The spectre of war, if you like, was the spectre of a revolutionary war from the East across to the West, the very war that Lenin was preparing for in 1920. That was the spectre. It turned out, because, I mean, one of the most intelligent statesmen in Europe, namely Hitler, fully understood all of this. He understood it in an extraordinarily, everything he understood was extraordinarily intuitive. And he understood the British even better than Lenin did. And his understanding was, well, the British are so obsessed with the spectre of war from the East that they're completely blinded to whatever we do from Central Europe. So there is, it's a bit vague, but there is some sense in which spectre is important, because these statesmen were haunted by a vision that in fact turned out to be true from 1945, but not true of 1938 to 9. The Russian armed forces had barely got the capacity to defend themselves properly in 1939, and the British and everybody else knew in their military assessments, the Russians had no offensive capability. But if you like, the British projections, it's difficult to get to this, but the British projections were into the 1940s. They even thought, when they assessed Hitler's capabilities in 1935, Orm Sargent at the Foreign Office said, well, they won't be ready for this for a dozen years.
Thank you. Now, in the book, you stress the importance of Germany, and you mentioned it in your remarks here as well. And Germany seemed somehow to be a fulcrum of what was going on, and a real focus of Soviet attention. Can you tell us a little bit why that was? Why was Germany such a battleground for both sides?
Well, I
in the
mean,
1920s?
yes, I mean, whatever happened to Germany, whatever problems and crises Germany had, it was the fulcrum of the European economy, the entire European economic system. And once Germany reunified, as you know, no system of a concert of Europe could work really without active German participation. And looked at from the East, it was even more so, because if you look at Germany from the Western side, you see, well, you know, they moved ahead on Britain in the 1880s, steel processing, you know, and all these technologies, but then so did Sweden, so did the United States. But when you look at it from the East, there was this saying that I put in my book, that Russian peasants thought that monkeys were made in Hamburg, because when the circuses first came into Russia at the end of the 19th century, they thought, oh, another example of German technology. So because Russia was so backward that every technology it had until we got to actually to World War II with some of their weapon systems was derivative. They were stolen copyright, stolen patents. So if you like, the huge size of Germany, population-wise, at the center of Europe, meant it stood out larger than life to those in Western Europe, particularly the French, who lacked babies, and the British, whose economy was spluttering. But from the East, you magnify it by 10 times. So Germany becomes, you know, if you can't harness the power of Germany through the Communist Party of Germany, which was the largest party of Europe until in the spring of 1933, then you're going to suffer the consequences, and you better find friends to protect yourselves against Germany.
But it's a tricky problem, isn't it, for Western policymakers, because they're trying to, and you set this out very well in the book, they're trying on the one hand to preempt the revival of Germany as a destabilizing factor in Europe. At the same time, they don't want Germany to be so weak as to be Bolshevized and lead to all the harms that you've described. But it's straightforward enough to define to identify the problem, but sort of seeing a solution isn't so easy, is it? I mean, what should they have done, do you think?
No, there's a reason why everything happened the way it did. I mean, you know, when you can go through all the British position papers on Germany through 36, you know, and I did indirectly through the eyes of E.H. Carr, who'd been my supervisor when I was writing his biography. So he was on one side, which was, you know, whatever you do, don't be nasty to the Germans, because we gave them the problem in 1919. We stripped them of their armies, we took away their money, and then we humiliated them. So basically, you deserve what you get. I mean, this was really Carr's position. He was very Germanophile. His generation in Edwardian England, the undergraduates were themselves German. This was a place of culture. This was a place of art. This was a place of music. So there were those people in the Foreign Office, as it were, the more liberal people, more Whiggish people. And then there were the people like Van Sittert, who took a much more robust view of Germany. And in fact, the previous permanent undersecretary from World War I would have taken an even more robust view. But Van Sittert was really pro-French rather than anti-German, and his prose was terrible, and he was easily caricatured for his position. So in fact, you found that the dead weight in the Foreign Office tended towards the position, well, we have to solve the German problem in favor of the Germans. And the question was, how do we do that without making it to the disfavor of everybody else? Well, in the end, they thought, who cares? the French will pay, the Poles will pay, the Czechs will pay, the Romanians will pay. And the British deluded themselves that that would be enough. In other words, all those who benefited from the Paris peace settlement would now have to pay up. But of course, it was too late. I mean, if Hitler had been Stresemann or even Schleicher, General Schleicher, that might have been conceivable, but he wasn't. In other words, I think in international relations, the principle of prudence is terribly important. And the principle of prudence was not observed in 1919 when they made these peace settlements. And Lloyd George, as usual, who was a terribly clever man, but he always took the easy way. And he took the easy way. We'll pacify the French in Europe and enlarge the empire in the Middle East. We need the oil. We have to have Mesopotamia. We don't want the French in the way. So let's not create too much trouble in Paris. And in fact, Lloyd George was one of those who later regretted the whole business of 1918, 1919. But then I guess whether A.J. Balfour, who was a great cynic, would have done the same thing, one simply doesn't know. It's not so easy to unravel this mess. I think once Hitler gets underway, by 1929, whatever you did, that German problem was no longer soluble as it had been while Stresemann was still alive. Under Stresemann, you had the possibility of mix and match. You could have put pressure on the French. You could then brought the Americans in behind you financially, etc., etc. They tried all this. Once Stresemann was dead, there wasn't a German option. There really wasn't.
Thank you. So questions are beginning to come in now, and I do encourage you to send more into the Q&A function. So the first one we have here is from Jack Eric Laya. And he, I think it's a he, is asking, given that the Soviet army in 1939 would not have been considered a colossus, was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact more an example of cold-blooded realism aimed at revising the Versailles settlement?
Yes, it was. It certainly was. But it wasn't just that, I would say. And remember, assessments of military power, you know, I'm always a skeptic about it, and you should be, because assessments of French military power turned out to be hopelessly wrong. And I think assessments of military power in isolation from other factors lead you down the wrong road. So Hitler's assessment of Russia, for example, which is a fascinating topic, and Johnny von Herwarth, who was in Russia analyzing the Bolshevik armies for Hitler, in his memoirs, he said, well, we didn't know what to do. We thought, shall we tell Hitler the Russians are terribly weak militarily, so he won't have any excuse to attack them? On the other hand, if we tell him they're terribly weak, he might have the urge to attack them. And you start to realize how military attaches write the order of battle of the country they're in, because you don't really know. And of course, as we now know, Hitler did get it wrong, because if Hitler had been correct in his assessment of the Bolshevik system, and within it, the Red Army, there wouldn't have been Stalingrad. I mean, Stalingrad didn't happen because Britain helped Russia or America helped Russia. The irony is Britain and America helped her after Stalingrad. Most of Lend-Lease came in after the Russians blocked the Germans and started pushing them back. So I would say, yes, it was an example of realpolitik, but it was more than that. What's interesting is how the realpolitik is woven into an ideological framework. So Stalin the Russians, the Bolsheviks, wanted to expand Soviet power. The non-aggression pact not only seemingly blocked them off so that Hitler would turn against the British and the French, it enabled the Soviet system to expand. The pattern of expansion of the Soviet Union from September mid-September 1939, is exactly the same as was done when the Russian armies entered the Balkans in 1944. Every country they went through, the system started to change, just as Milovan Djilas says in Conversations with Stalin. That's what Stalin told him they were doing. So you can't take the ideological factor out of there. It wasn't, the non-aggression pact was not just, okay, we sit where we are and, you know, we don't attack one another. That was the non-aggression pact. It was, no, we want to expand more. And when Stalin overdid it in the summer of 1940, by taking more of Romania than he'd agreed to, Hitler smelt a rat. You know, this was the Bolshevik plan. You know, where we show weakness, they will come through. And, you know, so I don't think one should take out, this wasn't the Tsar. This wasn't Tsar Alexander I. There was something additional to policy than Tsar Alexander I's balance of power.
Talk a bit about the Baltics in this context, which, as you say, were taken over by the Soviet Union. But of course, the Baltics also played a role earlier in the 1919 and the early 1920s, as you describe. And we have a question here from Hugo Bromley, who's research assistant at the Center for Geopolitics. And what he's wondering is, given British fear of communism emerging from Russia, which you've described so vividly, why did London not commit more fully to support their allies in the Baltic states and Poland against Russia? Did a wider fatalism about future conflict overcome fears of the spectre of communism, is the question.
Yes, I mean, it's difficult to put yourself in the mindset of these post-Victorian diplomats and politicians. If you think about it, from the time of Lord Salisbury, Britain starts to get back into Europe, having moved out basically in 1870 under Gladstone. That's a long period of time. It's half someone's lifetime as an official. And then the British get back in because all of a sudden they realize their industry is behind Germany. And, you know, the Kaiser's Germany is not Bismarck's Germany. It's aggressive, and something has to be done. So the idea that these new little states, they were new and little, that emerge in 1919 only because people like E.H. Carr and the Nationalities Minorities Committee decided to, as it were, help them get identity recognition as nation states. They weren't viewed as permanent. Those who took old-fashioned balance of power view of politics in the Foreign Office and beyond, you think of Balfour in particular, you know, they're just summer soldiers. They'll be gone. So if they'll be gone, why stand in anyone's way? Who cares? That the British attitude was, remember, Britain was running the largest empire in the world through force. It wasn't because we were invited into Africa or invited into Malaya or somewhere. These men, they weren't interested in what other countries thought. And these countries, including an independent Austria and a new Czechoslovakia, what was that? Made up of 3 different nationalities or ethnic groups. They wouldn't even call them nationalities, some diplomats. You know, who cares about them any more than we care about Swaziland or Tanganyika? What's going on in Ghana? What's the price of cocoa? Well, these statesmen had a global view, and their base was a power base of money in the city of London. That's what they cared about, that the empire would continue, and that their children, who, if they failed at school and never got into university and couldn't shoot straight, so they couldn't get in the army, didn't believe in God, so they couldn't go into the church, would be sent to the empire. There's a wonderful memoir of the man who ran the entire secondary school system in what is now Zambia. He hadn't even been to university. This is what you did with the useless products of the British middle class. Only India caused problems because they saw through the British and they realized the British would never be able to hold them down after the mutiny. In the end, if you stood together, you'd get them out. So people in London are obsessing about that. Don't come to them and talk about Latvia. Where's Latvia? Or where is Romania? And even Poland. Mm-hmm. Oh, the Poles are such trouble. Even Neville Chamberlain's foreign policy advisor, of course, knew nothing about foreign policy, complained how the Poles are such a pain in the neck. Well, the Poles were looking after their national interests, but somehow this wasn't viewed as entirely legitimate. So you've got an arrogance of power, which makes the arrogance of power in the United States in the early 60s over Vietnam seem minuscule compared with what prevailed in London. And that's why the collapse of empire in World War II was such a juddering experience for the British. They just never got over it. I was taught at school by these people. They were a sort of refugees from lost countries. My school friends have been thrown out of Nigeria or Tanzania, what became Tanzania, or why could they all swim so well? Because they grew up in the tropics. So the Britain that is today bears barely any relationship with this monstrous octopus empire, which gobbled up sections of the globe. It only lost that because it fought 2 wars over European issues. That's why it lost it.
Yes, and you describe this very vividly in the preface to the book about your own family background and how that also informs where you look at this period. And the audience, in fact, is interested to pursue this theme of, if you like, the British elite mind, because we have a question from Professor Rasmus Bertelsen, who teaches at the Arctic University of Norway. And he asks, what was the role of the Republican Democratic Germany, so Weimar Germany, in British geopolitical understanding in the 1920s, which bears obviously on this question that we've been talking about.
Now Germans were different. So there were very good reasons why Britain never opposed the reunification of Germany, quite apart from Queen Victoria's attitudes and Gladstone's attitudes. There grew from that time through to, well, I would say, perhaps the death of Queen Victoria, a sense of mutual identity with Germany, even though Germany wasn't an overseas empire. So those Germans you're talking about, civic, bourgeois Germans, who were supposed to be, if they'd been given the chance, the mainstay of the Weimar Republic, were the sort of people the British felt they could talk to and identify with and openly regret in company what they'd done to Germany in 1919. So this was the sort of Germany that Baldwin envisaged the Locarno Pact of 1925, safeguarding Germany's borders in the west, but not in the east, bringing Germany back into the center of the European economy, bringing Germany into the League of Nations, and on the back of that, rebuilding the European economy, and on the back of that, rebuilding the British economy. So the relationship, for example, between the Bank of England and the Reichsbank, these are like-minded people with like-minded visions. But all of that it was what they didn't realize, that this was a very delicate relationship that hinged upon the maintenance of the majority consensus in the Weimar Republic, the majority consensus that change could be made with time, in cooperative manner, with the British leading the way and the Americans bringing up the rear, because it was essential the Americans learned to forgive debts so that the British could forgive German debts. Whatever the French did, this was the view. So yes, these were the good Germans. These were the Germans who'd be badly dealt. These were the Germans who hadn't actually pushed for war in 1914. So the British did make this clear distinction between types. And I think it was because they naturally felt that the people they were most able to talk to must be the most influential, which is a typical misreading by politicians. And the people they didn't talk to were actually the ones who were gaining in influence. That was a tragic misperception.
Can we turn a bit to the present day, because you refer on a number of occasions in the book to lessons that should be learned, but that haven't been learned from the story you are describing. And I was wondering, could you elaborate on this? You come to it in the conclusion of it, but could you share with us this afternoon what lesson do you think your story has for the present day, and why do you think that lesson or those lessons are not being learned?
Okay, I think this is an issue that is more as easily understood by my generation and their parents in Germany than anywhere else in Europe, and certainly not the United States. So in Germany, you saw a government in power under the Kaiser from 1914, printing money like there was no tomorrow to pay for a major war they didn't want to raise taxes for. Because if they want to raise taxes, they have to go to the Reichstag, they have to start dealing, compromising. You know, you don't fight wars on that basis. So they just printed money. This became a habit. Then after the war, the French were demanding reparations, the British, the Americans, you got to pay for it. Were you going to tax German industry till the pip squeaked? I mean, the French, as was pointed out by the British, had this lunatic view that you got to crush the Germans into the dirt and get them to pay for the war. Well, either you crushed them into the dirt and you got no money, or you encouraged them to pay for the war and incentivized them. But that didn't happen because the French lost their tolerance of German reluctance to pay up and invaded with the Belgians in 1923 to take the reparations physically. And in doing that, they didn't just humiliate Germany. They didn't just rip out reparations, coal and the rest of it. They also started to begin the annexation of German territory. People in London just couldn't imagine what the mindset was. Well, in response, the German government just puts the printing presses into fast forward so that by 1924, German money was completely worthless, utterly worthless, the same as in Zimbabwe, and it's not much better now, but under Mugabe. They just printed like mad. Currency is worth nothing. What did that do? It wiped out, at a stroke, the savings of all those people we mentioned in the last question. All those good bourgeois Germans who saved money rather than spent money and were saving for the future, all of a sudden had no future. Not only that, mass unemployment took hold. So it was difficult to find a job. People had to dig up their jewelry and gold they'd hidden in the garden during World War I while the French came through to try to buy things with it, to live by. And then the Americans realized that if that carried on, there'd be Bolshevism in Germany the following day. So the Americans came in with the Dawes Plan and bailed out Germany. It was explicitly to preempt Bolshevism. And this worked, and Germany was refloated on American debt. But then this debt was withdrawn after the Wall Street crash in 1929. So it showed the interconnectability of the world economy in those days, no different from the sovereign debt crisis in 1998 or the problems in 2007, 2008. And this interconnectability of the world economy is what we have to worry about, because the Federal Reserve Bank, which is run by somebody who didn't even read economics at university, a lawyer, views himself as part of the administration in the United States, are printing money like the Kaiser did, and increasingly printing money, they call it other things, printing money as was done in 1923. The amount of indebtedness is massive, and it's worldwide, because once the Federal Reserve, turned on the taps, every other country except probably Singapore turned on the taps as well. Even the Chinese have huge private debt ratios, as well as you can buy, by the way, you can buy municipal Chinese debt if you want to. I wouldn't advise it. But, in other words, we're global. We're doing globally what the Germans did in their own country. What do you think is going to happen? At what point is somebody going to say, how much is an American treasury bond worth? Will I ever get my money back? Perhaps not. The Russians are selling all of their holdings in American treasuries and stacking up on gold. Russia's a major gold producer, but it's importing gold. It's hanging on to euros for the moment, but it's importing gold. If the Chinese even begin to do what the Russians are doing, the dollar will go through the floor. So, and these are the strong countries, imagine what the lesser countries are doing, who hold their currency reserves, not just in euros, but also in dollars. So the point about it is the stability of the 1920s in Europe was pivoted upon international financial and economic stability. But every 40 years or so, we get a major crash in the world economy, in the 1880s, then in 1929. Now, during the Bush era, the idea came about that, well, we can always stop that. We just print more money and we'll just do it for a while. And then it becomes a habit. And then everybody who works at the Federal Reserve has got used to it. So they call it by other names in case it's criticized. And my worry is, my serious worry is that what took place in Germany in the 20s, obviously in different forms, will take place in different places across the world. I'm not suggesting that fascism will emerge in the United States, but you have a level of public disorder during the election period last year in the United States, which was astonishing, given that there wasn't mass poverty everywhere. I mean, there weren't the political preconditions for it, the normal preconditions. And so that when you've got extremist fanatics who are always around, you just have to look for them, they don't count for anything in normal society. But when you pull away the underpins, the economic and financial underpinnings of society, as in Northern Ireland during the 60s and 70s, madmen start to become political leaders, and as political leaders wreak untold damage that takes decades to solve. So that's my rather bleak concern from history.
Well, you heard it here first. The spectre stalking our time isn't so much the spectre of communism of this excellent book, but the spectre of an international debt crisis and all the social and political consequences that might flow from that. Now, that's a whole new topic. which I think would sustain easily another hour. But unfortunately, we've run out of time, which is a great pity because it's been extremely interesting. I have to draw it to a close, not before doing two things. First of all, to remind everybody that this excellent book, The Spectre of War, is available at all good bookshops and online. And of course, to thank you, Jonathan, very much indeed, both for your opening remarks and for engaging with our questions so widely and so interestingly. But for us at the Center for Geopolitics, that's it. You can watch this program again on video. It'll be up on our website very soon. Thank you for being with us.